Welcome, Michael Frank, to Copenhagen. You are the author of a book called The Mighty Franks.
Thank you.
It's going to be published in Denmark in January 2018. And it's just been published recently in the US and is going to be published all around the world, I could imagine.
Several places.
Yeah, several
Very
places.
fortunately, yes. Thank you.
And could you tell me just in a few words what your book is about? I know it's a strange and very frustrating question to have as an author, but just to please me and the viewers.
I'd be happy to. Imagine how frustrating it was to live, let alone write about. But The Mighty Franks is a book about my family, which was arranged in a rather unusual way in the sense that there were two couples who married each other. My parents and my aunt and uncle are siblings. My father's sister is married to my mother's brother. Brother and sister, married sister and brother. The older couple, my aunt and uncle, were very accomplished Hollywood screenwriters, glamorous, worldly, crazy, and childless. And they desperately wanted a child in their lives, and so they borrowed me, in quotation marks, teaching me about art, literature, music, architecture, language, cinema, of course, the world. In addition, my two grandmothers, the widowed mothers of these two sets of siblings, lived together for 12 unhappy years, 10 minutes from us, and we lived 2 minutes from my aunt and uncle. So it was like a little village in the middle of Los Angeles. And not just any Los Angeles, but Laurel Canyon, which was a very special neighborhood up in the hills, secluded. It had a major music scene a little bit before my generation, full of creative people. But the truth was, the where of it is less important than the who. And the who is all about these people, my family.
So, quite an extraordinary, ordinary family, you might say.
An extraordinary, ordinary family, precisely.
And also a very intertwined family, as you explained.
Very intertwined.
But at the same time, I mean, it's two families that are being mixed. I mean, on your mother's side and on your father's side.
Exactly.
And as a reader of your book, it's two very different families. And especially, as you mentioned, there's your aunt and uncle, who are, again, married into your...
Yes.
The rest of your family, it's very complicated.
It is.
You have to read the book to really get a sense of it. But could you tell me a bit more about your aunt and uncle? Because they, as you said, they have been very important for you as a person, and you have been very close to them, and that's also what the book primarily is about.
Well,
your relationship with them.
It's about my relationship with them and their relationship with us. And,
yes.
You know, you talk about this intertwining. A friend of mine who's Italian, who knows all about families, you would think, said, it's very unusual in the sense that in most families, if you move outside a little bit, that's okay. But here, if you move outside, somebody's coming at you from another angle, because no one could speak up, have an independent point of view, challenge authority, disagree without there being repercussions. Because in addition to everything else, my aunt and uncle had a very firm grip on the way they saw the world, and the way they wanted us children as children to see the world too. A very strict hierarchy about what was good in architecture, what was important in literature, how one should speak, what art should be accepted and liked and what shouldn't be. Matisse was good, Pollock was bad, Brahms was good, the Mamas and the Papas definitely bad. That was a band in the 70s and 60s. And for a young person growing up with these very passionate adults, it became, of course, increasingly difficult to find my own way, you know, to find my own voice. When I was very young, of course, they were magical people. It was like a kind of enchantment, a fairy tale, to be loved as much as I was, to be singled out from my brothers and taken off on adventures, to be given so many material things and to be given so many intellectual things. Obviously, I've been very formed by the experience of this childhood, but at the same time, I also had to set myself free from it, and that was, of course, quite difficult. What made them so special also was their extraordinary creativity. This went back, in fact, to my grandmother. She was the one who called us the Mighty Franks, who invented that phrase when, in 1939, she left Portland, Oregon, which is a small provincial city in the Pacific Northwest, and came to Hollywood, where she went to work for Louis B. Mayer, who was the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer MGM, a major motion picture studio at the time. And her job was to read books and help them decide whether they should become movies. So it was a very powerful job for a woman in those days, and she was very talented. She would take a book home overnight, read it, work it out in her head, and come in and tell the story in half an hour, because nobody read, they simply listened.
Yeah.
And so she started this whole idea of who are these people?
And also, if I may interrupt you,
Please.
because she was growing up as a woman in a totally different environment with her family in Portland.
Exactly.
So it was a very big thing for her to break with the family.
Exactly.
And with the husband.
Exactly.
And go to Los Angeles.
Absolutely. There's the myth. I've just written a little essay about this. There's the myth and there's the reality. The reality is, the myth is what you just said and what I just said.
And what you were told by your aunt.
What I grew up with.
Yeah,
exactly.
what you grew up with.
And this is like opening a parenthesis to say that one of the other powerful tools my aunt and uncle had in their tool chest was their storytelling. And so they would tell stories about our family that were myth-like.
They were storytellers
by
profession
exactly.
and temperament.
Exactly. Yeah. Everything was a story. They didn't just speak, that they spoke in perfect dialogue. When they became angry at you, they would send you a telegram in dialogue saying the friendship is over, the relationship is over. It was like, oh my God. But so the myth they told about my grandmother was exactly that. The reality that I've pieced together, because one thing that happens to you if you're born into such a family, in such a world, is you become a detective.
Yes.
And you have to figure out what is the truth, in fact. And my grandmother went to Berkeley. She also went to Reed College in Portland, so she was educated. She eventually had gave lectures to women's groups, and this was during the Depression. She would have done anything. She had a radio show. She had a cousin.
Maybe you could show the cover of your book, because the whole family, the whole Frank family is there.
This is my grandmother. This is shortly after they came. So they came to Los Angeles in 1939. This is during the war, so it's 4 or 5 years later, and they've really come up in the world. I mean, there's my aunt, my very powerful aunt, her husband who joined them, but their marriage was open. They both had boyfriends and girlfriends, another complication, and my young father.
Yeah.
And
you can see the charisma of your aunt on this picture, I think.
Yes, the Frida Kahlo-like flower, as people say in her hair. So there's always this interplay between the mythic and the actual, and finding your way through them. I think we all grow up with stories, right, in our family, and knowing where the authentic is very important for you to find your own way through the world. Who are you to become if you can only model yourself on the pattern of these myth makers, right? So it began with my grandmother. I think I opened that parenthesis. But my aunt and uncle were very open to myth making themselves, and they had a very interesting early career. My uncle tried to write plays. My aunt wrote anything in the world, short stories, movie scripts, treatments for movies, which were ideas for movies. And then in the 1957 or so, mid-50s, they started writing together. And
they met each other at a movie lot, right, in Hollywood?
They met. My uncle saw my aunt, who was not an ugly young person. She was actually quite beautiful. And he bribed the man who had the desk next to her $50, which I think if you do the translation, it was probably like $500 today, to let him sit next to her in the office. And they soon started going out together, and they married a year later. And when they married, these two very different families came together, which of course I tell about in the book. And at that time, my mother was 13 years old, and she met this incredibly glamorous, sophisticated older woman of 21 or 22.
And you actually have a scene in the book where are they having a bar mitzvah?
Yes,
you come from a Jewish family,
exactly, a Jewish family, and
you can tell us about that scene?
The first time my mother laid eyes on my aunt, she was 13. It was her bat mitzvah. And my aunt and uncle, then a young couple, unmarried, arrived late. and everyone was waiting for them. And suddenly the door opened. Even this was like a movie, of course, at least in the retelling, but I think probably also in the living. And in walked this incredibly glamorous woman in a green dress with leaves in her hair, because she used to dress in a very eccentric way, always asking for attention. And my mother's mouth just dropped open, and she stared at this woman. And afterward, my aunt said to her, "You and I will be the best of friends." And in fact, my mother, for the next 7 years, before she married my father, the next 10 years, was in a way the protege of my aunt in a similar way that I would become a generation later. You know, if we were speaking only in literary terms, we would say it was foreshadowing, in that she had this experience that was like my experience first, but a woman's experience. She taught her how to dress, how to talk, how to do her hair, how to arrange her rooms, what books to read, what movies to like. Similarly,
and as in your case, as you describe in the book, it takes a long time if you have been lured in by a person like that. You use that word yourself in the book.
Yes.
To be, that was one of the strategies of your aunt, to lure people in and get them very close to her. And then, of course, it takes a lot of power and years to get away from that power she holds over you, and for your mother as well.
Absolutely. And I think that, one of the questions that often comes up is, why did your parents, people ask me, why did your parents share you and your brothers, but share so openly? And part of the reason was my aunt and uncle were fantastic people. They were the fantastic Franks too.
Yeah. Michael, you are enthralled by this glamorous Hollywood couple. They are intelligent, they are charismatic, they are artistic, and you, as a boy, you're a very sensible boy. You're very you out of your 3 kids, your 3 brothers, and you.
This is the
why
question.
Are you?
Why me? I don't. This is one of those questions I still can't answer.
Yeah.
Even having lived it and written the book. Why me? I was the first. I was artistic myself. I was a big reader. But maybe I would have been none of those things. Maybe I'd be out driving a truck if it weren't for my aunt and uncle. I'll never know that. But I was the one selected. I was the one most loved.
Yeah.
And I was the one for whom they had the greatest expectations. Those expectations, however, came at a price. They meant that you had to do things their way. You had to always be in line with them. And of course, life doesn't work out like that as you grow up. And so
But for many years.
For many,
many years, you accepted that condition.
Through my very early childhood. But when my grandmother died, I was 10 years old. So the Hollywood grandmother, let's call her, the mother of my aunt and my father. Something happened to my aunt. They had been very, very close. They used to say, we are beyond mother and daughter. We are best friends. We tell each other everything. When my grandmother died, my aunt, something broke in her, something shifted, and she became needier and darker and more complicated. And so her darkening coincided with my waking up. Because
how old were you at that
10,
time?
11, 12. And I began to wonder about things, as one does. I began to say, I don't agree. Or I began to say, I'm not available. She needed you. When she called, picked up the phone, you had to be there immediately. I began to say,
you could just run over the hill?
Run right over the hill, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. I began to say, I don't like that movie. Or I don't think I like that book. And she would take every single disagreement so very personally. And she began to think that people were trying to separate us. She felt my mother was making problems. She felt my father had stopped loving her. And this became a pattern that became more and more pronounced as time went by. And her behavior became more and more extreme. And being this very powerfully verbal person with a huge temper, everyone also could be very angry in that family. My grandmother, my uncle, my father, my aunt, my little brother. And she would have these eruptions of language in which she would tell you...
With a very sharp tongue.
Very sharp tongue. She would tell you everything that you had done wrong. She would tell you that she had given you all this love and you had given her nothing in return. And these attacks would be withering. I mean, you're still a child, I think, at 12, 13, 14, a teenager. You don't know what to do with these things. And nor did the whole family. And at first people would behave as though, well, this was a moment. And then because everyone was intertwined, because everyone had dinner twice a week, because the grandmothers either lived together or one of them was alive and needed taking care of, everyone would come together again. And then things would go smoothly for a while. Then they would erupt again, smoothly erupt. But the eruptions became bigger and bigger. The conflict became more and more problematic. And really what it ended up doing, without giving away the end of the book, is it broke apart our family. It wasn't the family that began in 1939 when they came to California, in 1946 when the older couple got married, in 1956 when the younger couple got married, or when we children came along in the 50s and 60s afterwards. And it has taken me, obviously, some time to figure out how to live this story, and longer to figure out how to write it. You know, I didn't want to write a book that was angry. I didn't want to write a book that was about revenge. I wanted
So it's not a revenge memoir, this
most
book?
Certainly not.
No, it's a book of love and...
understanding. The way I think of it is, I wanted to be able to write this book out of curiosity, so that I could review the experience of my early life and try to understand it, to recapture it in that sort of, if I may, Proustian way of bringing the past back with authenticity and truth, not judging what happened, but presenting it, and allow the reader to figure out for himself or herself what he thinks about these people. I lay out the experience, I use dialogue, I tell it in scenes, I move through time. I try to understand. That's what I set myself the goal of in this book. And it is a book of the middle of life. I tried to write it, as I wrote in the book, when I was younger as a novel. And I was still too angry, I was still too confused, I wasn't distant enough, I had not yet married or had my own child, so I hadn't removed myself enough from this experience. This enchantment, this family held on for a very long time. It's a very strong glue. I think all families are like that. I think all families also often have in them, many of my readers have said, an extreme personality. Maybe not exactly like my aunt, but someone who ends up taking the power. You know, there's always someone in the family who has more power. A mother, a father, a grandmother, a grandfather, in this case, an aunt. And I think people have responded to this struggle with power, this struggle with power that takes over and at the same time seduces and enchants you.
And also maybe what struck me and moved me very much as a reader and a person is also that every family needs to have reconciliation to move on. You have to reconciliate yourself with what has happened in your family. It might come late in life, but you have to do it to be whole as a person.
I agree
completely.
You? Absolutely. And it doesn't happen all at once.
No.
It happens in little steps. In the same way, you know, and that's why it's a story, I think, that makes an arc like this, like a novel, in the sense that in the beginning you fall in love, right? And in the beginning you begin to wake up. It all takes little steps. It's not like all of a sudden my aunt overnight became Donald Trump, you know? It wasn't like that. But she was tyrannical also, and little signs in the beginning that became stronger when my grandmother died, that became stronger still when I started pulling away. And it transformed. People change, families change, circumstances change. And so does understanding. You start understanding and having reconciliation and compassion after you get to a certain point, but it takes more time. It takes their aging. Things happen in the book I won't tell you because I'd rather you read it. But you know, things happen in the book that force me, and I hope also the reader, to see them differently as these people age, to see the fear in these people, to see the weakness, to see their own struggle, you know, which is really what it is to become an adult, is finally to see the people you grew up with more nuanced and complicated vision.
Which also prepares the road for reconciliation and understanding. Isn't it?
Absolutely,
Yeah, and
because you can't arrive there until you first are curious, until you first notice, until you first analyze and understand.
And may I ask you, because as far as I understand, your aunt is still alive, isn't she? She turned 100 this year?
You know, that's a mistake. That's on Wikipedia. She's 94.
Oh, she's 94.
Only 94.
Only 94.
Only 94.
Okay, yeah.
And your
But
question,
still alive.
She's still alive.
Still alive,
Yeah.
yeah. Has you discussed your book with her? Or has she
So,
read it?
This, as you know, or don't know, because I'm about to tell you, this is one of the questions that I don't answer. And
Okay.
the reason is, three reasons. One is I'm protecting the old people who are still alive, my parents and my aunt. The second is I feel that I tell the story, I feel, completely in the book up to a certain point, which is when my uncle dies. And the third is, of course, I'm going to write a sequel.
It's like 10 years ago?
5.
5 years ago?
And I'm going to write another book which continues the story forward and also looks back at my grandmother's life, because I do think the one question I don't think I've answered, because it's not answerable maybe, or because it really wasn't the question of this book, is how did my aunt come to be the person she came to be? And I think that the answer lies in her relationship with my grandmother and in my grandmother's life. And my grandmother kept a diary, I kept a diary. She kept a mysterious diary that I was forbidden from seeing for all of my life.
You mention it in the book as well.
Exactly.
And also that you are forbidden from seeing it.
Yes, and that diary I'm going to look at and talk about and
Have you looked at
explore.
it already?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the next story.
Yeah. So no revelations in this interview about
Not in this interview.
about the diary. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned for what I call the
For the
prequel,
sequel, yeah.
the prequel or the sequel, or both. We'll see. Yes.
A pre-sequel.
A pre-sequel, exactly.
Thank you very much,
You're
my
so
friend.
welcome. Thank you for having me.